Good evening, everyone. Thank you for coming in person, online, or whenever you're watching this. Tonight's topic, as you can see, is the St. Paul campus. And I guess I'm pretty safe with this. I always wonder when I go out to speak at a church, I was just out at Apple Valley for 3 weeks, if what I've prepared and brought is what's been advertised. So when you're doing both the promotion with Mary's great help and the preparation, I'm pretty sure that I'm going to talk about the St. Paul campus tonight, so we're safe on that one. So the usual shenanigans up front here. We meet a little bit off schedule next time. Well, we meet. I'll be here showing pictures a little bit off schedule. The next time is the last Tuesday of April, and it's a makeup session for January when I was going to talk about Commonwealth Avenue, and then came down with what turned out to be COVID. I didn't know it for 10 days, but finally took a test, and that's what it was. So we've squeezed this in because we have enough Tuesdays in April to manage that. And then back to the regular schedule, Hampton Park neighborhood on Tuesday, May 13th, and then that's the last of the series this season. As usual, you can wait for my email announcement or check the issue of the Bugle to just see what's coming up. But you can always go to my webpage, christineanderson.org, and on the events page, which you can get to from the front page, there's a list of events that are coming up. So this is the announcement for the Commonwealth talk. Also at the webpage, I fixed a problem. I've advertised SAP maps now for a while, and then I realized there was a problem with the address. I don't know if anybody tried to get into it, but I've fixed it, so it works now. This is not linked from anywhere on the page, so you need to remember it or take a picture of it. So it's my regular web address /SAP maps. So it's a handy place to look at a lot of plat maps, and I've added some stuff. I'll talk about that in a minute. If you are one of those folks who had a University of Minnesota address that you don't have anymore, I know there are at least 4 of my messages that get bounced back from my email list. You can sign up again, and there's my address, and I will try to deal with it. And those of you who've written to me over the last, say, 2 years are probably laughing your heads off. If you're at home, you can do that out loud. Otherwise, here people are just being polite. I will get to your messages. People have sent me all kinds of great stuff, pictures and comments and questions, and then kind of full-blown house history requests. I might start a house history business, as a matter of fact. And I think, oh yeah, I'll deal with these emails. You know what this is like. I've got a half hour. I'll do like 5 or 6 of them. Well, half hour is rarely enough to do one of them. So I'm way behind on emails. But once I stop doing presentations for the summer, there'll be fewer of them coming in, so I'll have a chance of catching up. So please be in touch if you're not on the email list and you want to be, or if you have one of those University of Minnesota addresses and you want to update me about it. And then I promise I will get to things at some point, I hope very soon. So, St. Paul campus today, a very fun topic to do. It was one of the topics for a summer walking tour last year, and then I also met with a graduate seminar from St. Thomas, and their topic was campuses. And so they came over for a tour, and they had a good time because they weren't in the classroom, and I had a good time because they knew a whole lot about what I was talking about, so that was really fun. But it's a beautiful place, as you probably know. It's quite photogenic. It's very interesting. I hope you'll get a little taste of that this evening. And tonight, special treat, my pictures. This is one of my pictures. I try to do my best, try to frame them right and all the rest, but we have some special pictures this evening because Dave Hansen, who is sitting there in row 4, there he is raising his hand, a son of the neighborhood, a son of this congregation, and former University of Minnesota employee whose job it was to be the photographer for the St. Paul campus. And he's been kind enough to share his pictures with me. And so I've got all kinds of super gorgeous professional pictures that are included tonight, like this lovely one. And this one, look, I put snow in. I told him I wasn't going to include snow because it doesn't go over well this time of year. But there's no snow outside, and we've got a lot of hope, I think, for the spring. So there is a lovely picture with snow in it. And activities, he didn't just do the buildings, even though that's what I'm mostly interested in. So it's Beautiful You Day, and all I can think of is that cow on the right is ready to snack on what's on the table. as soon as that guy stops talking, I wish I had been there to see whether that happened. And then, of course, real cows. So lots of cool stuff. And here's the official credit. David L. Hansen, University of Minnesota. So thanks to Dave, you can enjoy these pictures all the way through. I have another photographer to credit, Samuel Green. Yay. Seriously, round of applause for S.B. Green. So you maybe don't know the name offhand, but you'll see his house in the Commonwealth presentation. He built a house or bought a house at the corner of Commonwealth and Raymond. And then he moved farther up Raymond. He was instrumental in getting College Park turned into a park and planting trees in College Park. He planned out the trees on the St. Paul campus originally. He was one of the leaders in the St. Anthony Park Improvement League. And they did things like get sidewalks and get things paved and get streetlights and drain the swamps and do all kinds of stuff. So he was a great neighborhood citizen and a great citizen on campus as well. And he took pictures. And his photo album was donated to the U. And Dave not only takes pictures, he scans other people's pictures. And so I've got many of the old pictures that you'll see are pictures that came from Green's photo album. So lots of great stuff. I hope you learned something tonight. I hope you remember things that you maybe knew before, see some interesting things. That's always the hope. But this isn't the end. You can, I hope, walk around the campus, bike around the campus. It's a beautiful place for a stroll. They've got a lot going on in terms of gardening and growing things, of course. And so you don't just walk once. You can go back over and over again, and there's a lot to see and learn. And here at the B building, the B lab, they've made a point of setting out some information so you can learn. You can look for these maroon and gold plaques all around the campuses. So here's what that one says about a Slovenian priest who came to the U.S., served mostly German congregations. I learned while a Slovenian professor was here studying his brother John Jager, an architect, that Archbishop Ireland used to send the Slovenian priests to the German churches, because if they had German priests, they were hard to control. The Slovenian priests all spoke German, and it was a way he could kind of keep things under control. So there's Father Jager in a few of these pictures. He was, as I guess many Slovenians are, a beekeeper. They have a great tradition of that, and he introduced all of this to the University of Minnesota. So he had parishes around the Twin Cities area, and he also taught on the St. Paul campus. So if you go on campus, you'll encounter signs like these that will give you a chance to learn about what's going on. And then, after I'd put all these presentation materials together for the tour, it was before I put tonight's presentation together, but I discovered a website that it's like, who needs Kristen when you have this website? So it's an interactive website on campus history. And this is what you're looking at here is a 1917 map superimposed on a contemporary map that you can move the map around, and it goes from the St. Paul campus all the way over to the West Bank. So if you zoom way out, you can see a lot of the Twin Cities. You can zoom way in on it as well. And then here's an example of how they've highlighted in gold historic buildings. And you can kind of see where they sit in relationship to other buildings. This is 1917 again. And if you click on one of the buildings, you'll get the name of the building, and it'll say year built and the year raised, and then search UMedia for photos. So if you click on that last line, it'll take you to a page like this. And you can see photographs of these buildings. So it's a pretty fun site. And if there's anything that intrigues you in specific or just in general, checking this out would be a fun idea. I'll also pitch UMedia. I did a little search for David L. Hansen, and check it out, 41,152 results. Now, I don't think those are all his photographs. He can probably come up with the correct number, because the first thing I saw on this search was a picture that he took. And the second picture I saw was a picture of his dad. And his name was not anywhere. So I think it was one of those crazy searches where Hansen, S-E-N, or David, any of those words show up, and then you probably get those results. But we are talking about tens of thousands of pictures, right? Yes. Mm-hmm. So maybe not 41,000, but many of these are his pictures. So you can search this, or you can search a building name, or Samuel Green or whatever you want, and this is at U Media. How am I supposed to remember these cool things? You say to yourself, well, you go to kristenanderson.org/SAP maps, where you've maybe been before, and if not, take a picture of this. And I have added 2 links at the top of the page. So here is the interactive campus map, toy, and here's the U Media main site, which will allow you to work with and play with those things. There's no one watching, there's no exam. You can just go and try them out and have fun. I hope you do. All right, St. Paul campus. It's interesting. You know, it's an interesting place, but I'd like to suggest to you through these pictures, but also through your exploration or your knowledge of the space, it's an especially beautiful campus. It has a very interesting terrain, which you might not recognize from this aerial view, but where the water tower sits is a really high spot. They often put water towers on high spots, as is the parking lot. And then there's a fairly steep hill right here, and some really creative buildings that are 3-4 stories tall here, and then back on this side, 6-7 stories tall as they're built down the hill. Some of the buildings up here, like Borlaug, for instance, right there, will connect older buildings that are down on the hill. They've worked with the terrain in some really interesting ways. Also, yeah. Yes? Sure. We'll start maybe over here. Cleveland Avenue is over here. So the fields that go up towards Larpenteur are here at the bottom and then off the bottom of the slide. Those are cows. That's the St. Paul Gym. This was the Student Health Services, now it's a chiller plant. Here's Bailey Hall, the big 1950s plus 1970s dormitory. Here are the 3 beautiful buildings, 1906, 1911, 1925, that line the lawn. Does that help to orient you a little bit? Yeah, you're welcome. And streets, I mentioned where Cleveland is. This is Falwell, down at the bottom. And if you keep going here off the slide, you'll reach Cleveland. And over here on the left is Gortner, which heads out as far as Commonwealth down here. And down off the bottom of the slide, it'll get you up to Larpenteur. So, yeah, thanks for asking about that, because it gets to be a little head spinning sometimes. So, a campus, they're always interesting. They're like little cities, little towns. It's an especially beautiful campus. Thanks, Sam Green, for planting all those trees so thoughtfully. It also is a different kind of campus. We're accustomed to campuses that have people who live there and eat there, people who commute there, they go to work there as faculty or staff, and then they leave. There are classes, there are all kinds of things that go on. But here, the residents include another set of creatures or beings. So the animals of a variety of sorts. We get all the plant life that's here. So then it's like eating and housing and feeding and taking care of the animals as well as the students on the campus. I'll just leave that there. Students, animals, we'll let that sit. So it's especially interesting because it has this different set of functions that go along with it. It's also interesting, I think, from our perspective in looking at the history and architecture of St. Anthony Park, that it's so closely associated with the neighborhood. It is, of course, right next door. And here you can see in the 19-teens what they used as the address for what we call the St. Paul campus or the farm campus was University Farm, St. Anthony Park. That's how they located it. And it's not technically in St. Anthony Park. It's not in St. Paul. It's in Falcon Heights. But the association of place was really, really strong with the neighborhood. And quite strong in the sense that they relied on the neighborhood. We'll just go back here, being right next door, for all kinds of things. Housing for faculty, for staff, for students. Many of the houses up in this northeastern section of the neighborhood were actually built so that they were maybe bigger than necessary for a typical family, so you could rent rooms to students. And there was a time in the 19-teens when I read the regents discussing whether they should build another dorm on this campus, and they said, oh no, there's plenty of housing in St. Anthony Park. They can just go and find a room in the neighborhood. Grocery stores, where MIMS was, that was built as a grocery store with apartments upstairs. Religious communities, not just that some kid coming in from central Minnesota who wanted to go to a Methodist church could find a Methodist church fairly close. But the churches, many of them, the best example is the UCC church. They built close to the campus on purpose. In fact, they had a grant from a congregation in downtown St. Paul that was closing. And they said, here, you can have these tens of thousands of dollars if you build close to the U, so that you're helping all of us serve the students. So there's a lot of kind of crossing the border. It wasn't as though there was a fence down Cleveland and they couldn't get through. It's pretty permeable, and the connections were really quite strong. This view, by the way, I don't know if you've figured it out yet, there are two buildings here that survive. And it's not the view that we usually get. We think of the view across the fields with the buildings and the water tower. Or we think about that beautiful view with the lawn and the three big buildings, Coffee Hall and the other two. But this was the typical view for a long time. It's from the southeast. So we're looking towards the northwest. And the way to think about it is the huge number of people that would see the campus from the State Fair grandstand, looking towards the northwest. And this is what they would see. The campus kind of opens up in that direction. So what still survives is Coffee Hall, right here. And that building right there is the old horticulture building, the one in the background. Otherwise, everything else is gone. There's plenty of stuff there, but it's all been replaced with other things. But that view was frequently photographed, and it happened over decades where you could see buildings being added because this was the way that people understood or thought of or saw the St. Paul campus on a regular basis. Not a view from this drone, for instance, but not a view like this at ground level, for instance. We think about the campus in other directions, like, again, across the lawn and looking at the fronts of these buildings. This? Nope, this is part of McNeil Hall, which actually now extends all the way down the hillside. Home Economics Building, 1914. Yep. The old horticulture building is right there in the center. Let's see. Stay with me. Yes, it's a different view. Yep. If you were an eagle or something, you'd go, yeah, this is what it looks like all the time. So I bought 3 different sets of batteries to get this laser pointer to work because I was at this church in Apple Valley for 3 weeks, and the second week my Spotlight remote didn't work, or laser pointer. So I thought, okay, I'll re-up. So that's the 1914 Home Ec building. The old horticulture building is right there. It faces Buford. That's Coffee Hall right there. Yep, of course. Okay, so how and why do we get here? Why not just have this in Minneapolis with the rest of the campus? What drove them to do this? Well, this guy, in a sense, this is Justin Morrill. He was a Vermont congressman, and he is famous for the Morrill Act. Morrill, that kind of moral, the Morrill Act. 1862, signed into law by Abraham Lincoln. It was a landmark piece of legislation for higher education, to be sure, and it is, as it says at the top, an act donating public lands to the several states and territories which may provide colleges for the benefit of agriculture and the mechanic arts. So this was a country building, community building kind of effort. There were a lot of schools that just had arts and sciences. And then there were other schools that had things like medicine, law, education, how you build a society, how you build a community. And to make sure that agriculture, science, engineering, applied science, those kinds of things were considered, the Morrill Act says, we'll get you some funds to build a school if you agree to teach these things. So you can see there's some stipulations. This is just the top of the list. There were a whole bunch of other things that were included, but here it says that the states would get public land apportioned to each state a quantity equal to 30,000 acres for each senator and representative in Congress, to which the states are respectively entitled by apportionment under the census of 1860. Minnesota had 4 people, so they got 30,000 times 4, 120,000 acres. Provided, as you can see, no mineral land shall be selected or purchased under the provisions of this act. Also provided, although they didn't say it, that you just ignore the fact that a lot of this land that was being scooped up was actually under indigenous control, and off it went. So this is often called the land grant system, but it's recently, the last 10 years or so, people have started to call it the land grab instead of land grant. So it was pretty popular. I think there were 61 institutions that took advantage of this 1862 law, and then there were 2 more rounds of it where other institutions were included. Texas A&M. A stands for agriculture, M stands for mechanical. So this is an example of one of those institutions. Here's another, Florida A&M. This is an HBCU. The HBCUs, historically black colleges and universities, were included in the second round as a part of Reconstruction. Also, by the way, one of the things that was prohibited, in addition to you can't use lands, mineral lands, if you were an insurrection or rebellion state, you didn't qualify in 1862. So Texas, some of those other places, they get involved in the 1870s, still under the 1862 provisions. I wanted to ask you if you recognize this one. This is LSU, lovely campus. Lovely picture of a lovely part of the campus, at least. LSU is Louisiana State University, full name, Louisiana State University and Agricultural and Mechanical College. We don't even think about LSU being an A&M, but it is, and it's even in their name. So some institutions started from scratch to take advantage of this possibility. And some, like Texas A&M, still have it in their name. Others, especially institutions that have state in their name, started out as A&M. So Colorado State was Colorado A&M. Oklahoma, Arkansas, state. So there's the University of Kansas and there's Kansas State. That distinction often grew out of the schools that were started as the A&M institutions. Places like Wisconsin, Minnesota, included the agricultural and mechanical education as a part of an overall umbrella. And Minnesota, although it had been kind of getting going since the early 1850s, it was a lot of stops and starts. And then finally in 1868, the legislature said, yep, we'll scoop you in and this will be official for you, for the state. And they specified medicine, law, education, arts and sciences, and agricultural mechanical. So that was the requirement that the state legislature put on the U. Well, this carries over in other ways as well. Which building is this? Morrill Hall, named for Justin Morrill from Vermont. Top picture? I didn't think you'd know. Cornell University, Morrill Hall. Lower left, Morrill Hall at the University of Vermont. On the right, Morrill Hall at Iowa State. Many of these institutions have a building named after Justin Morrill for kind of obvious reasons. It was an important part of the development of these institutions and then presumably of the states and communities they supported. Not Morrill Hall. This is the agricultural building at the university campus in Minneapolis. It was, I think, the second building that was built on the campus that we know now. It was built in 1875. Took a while for them to get their act together. And it burned down, I think, in 1888. It only lasted 13 years, which wasn't bad. There's more to the story coming up. So you can see the greenhouse over on the left. Most of these buildings had a horse standing out in front. You can see that one's over on the right. I'm not sure what the chimneys are in the right wing of the building. I know that blacksmith shops were important parts of these buildings for obvious reasons, and so it's possible that's what's going on that end. Here's the early campus in about 1890 when the agriculture building was gone. So we're looking here at Pillsbury Hall, still standing. Nicholson, which was the chemistry and physics building. Eddy Hall, I think it's still there. I haven't been through for a while. Oldest building on campus, and last I knew, mothballed. Still? Anybody know? Okay, and Old Main, burned down late 19th, early 20th century. And then I think US Bank Stadium, right there. I'm honestly not sure what that is. I think it might be the Coliseum. They had a great big meeting performance hall that was off in that direction. It's possible that's what it is. So the agricultural building sat here. So the main building was first, a number of additions going on the back of that, and then the ag building, and then I think Eddy Hall came next. And at the time it was built, and for some time after that, it was the Mechanic Arts building. So they were kind of serious. They evidently had classrooms for their other disciplines inside their main building, which was typical for universities to start with just one building and put everything in it. But then when they had the money for this, they started to spin off the separate buildings. So the ag building, again, was there for just a bit, but not, it's a long way from the St. Paul campus, right? So you teach your classes here and you grow things in the greenhouse and then you have to haul them way over here to St. Paul? Actually, that wasn't the plan. They acquired land with their land grant money to get property in Section 30, which is right there. So here's Section 29. That's where much of South St. Anthony Park is. Here's Section 20. We're in Section 20 right now. In fact, we're about a block away from the center of Section 20. It's just back that way down Como, across the street from Buford, on the Seminary Hill. So there's a marker up there, something to look for on your walks. So here's the property that they bought. They had the northwest quarter of Section 30, and you can maybe see right there, A.G. Call Grounds. That's where they were going to have their farm. And they discovered a couple of things. First of all, the soil was really bad. Some of it was swampy, a lot of it was sandy. And then, with some foresight, they thought this might have some issues with urban encroachment. Maybe not a good place for their farm. So it was fairly close to the campus. Here's the original campus of the U, along University Avenue. And here's where that sat. I just want to check out one thing here before we leave this slide. Where they started to look for new property was on Como Avenue. And we go, huh? Didn't quite work out that way, right? Well, what they called Larpenteur at this point was Lake Como Road, or Como Avenue. And what they called Como was sometimes Park Avenue, later Langford Avenue, sometimes Lake Avenue. So here's Como as it was kind of designed at that point, and then coming out this way, this was the county road. And Larpenteur was Lake Como Road. So an old road that went from St. Paul towards Minneapolis, a diagonal here, which is kind of interesting, down from what's now Larpenteur to Como, and then across from there. So this doesn't exist anymore, but it started one block east of where 280 is. That's a street that goes up into Larpenteur. I'm sorry, I don't know the name of it. And then it went off at this angle towards the southwest and joined Como. And if you're ever in that little industrial area where the trucks go through and there's a coffee roasting place, 33rd, I think, is the street that connects Como to Hennepin. If you go through there, you're going to cross a couple of railroad tracks. And the other thing is that there's a building, I think it has something like Midwest Printing in it. There's a building there that doesn't have a regular rectilinear shape. One of the walls is a diagonal. And that building was old enough to be along this road when the road still existed. It's the only thing I can see that still has a remnant of that. And of course, 280 and its ramps are all in the way. So, of course, most of it's gone. But there's that one building that you might want to look for. Okay, so there are the grounds, and then didn't quite work out. They did have trouble getting things off the ground. In fact, they did when they moved over here in the 1880s as well. Here, just before we leave the not going to work Minneapolis farm, I wanted to show you again where it was. Along the left side of the map, here is Oak Street, and that's the edge of Section 30. And then Section 30 ends up here where that little X or the cross is, going across the vacated Marshall Street or Avenue. I'll talk about that next time. So the section is over here. This is what we're looking at. Notice that this section, platted is called the Regents Edition. The university sold this land, and then it was platted for other purposes, residential purposes, industrial purposes. And what's in that spot now, here's one thing that might help you locate it. That little pink rectangle, that's fire station number 19. So now it's a Buffalo Wild Wings. And the Huntington Bank Stadium sits up here in this corner. So they decided to sell that land and look for something else. And their agriculture professor, I think they had just one at that point, went out scouting land and said, I think I found it, brought the regents out to have a look. And the property was in fact purchased before the other property had been sold. John S. Pillsbury, who had been a governor or was a governor to come, was a regent at the U, very committed to the U. He bought the property that's now the university campus and said, I'll take care of this, and when you sell the other property, you can just reimburse me. And that's what happened. So the property that they got was the M.D. Bass property, 155 acres along Como Avenue. Remember, that's Larpenteur. Here's the diagonal, hitting Como in Minneapolis. Here is the Gibbs property, and that square shows where the Gibbs house still stands. Lots of truck farmers along here. There's Lindig, Hermes. You know any of these names from the old florists along there? So these are old families in that area. The Basses were not farmers. They were very wealthy real estate people. But there's that farm. They rented property. There was somebody using it, and that building was torn down at the time that the U came in. This line right along here is Cleveland. Right there, that's Cleveland. Here's Lake Sarita, so this is near the corner of Cleveland, Raymond, and Como. That's supposed to be Langford Lake, I think. So this is way back before the 1873 plan for the neighborhood. But here's the Bass Farm. Right near it is the Ramsey County Poor Farm, which turned into State Fairgrounds, right? So keep in mind, right around the time this is all getting going in the mid-1880s, the State Fair has just gotten that property as a gift from Ramsey County, 1885. St. Anthony Park is being developed, and the university is getting going. So they came out Como Avenue, and they were looking at these fields and checking the soil, and then they discovered this big M in the ground. And they thought, oh my gosh, here it is. It's a sign. Yeah, we know where we're supposed to be. So we're on Larpenteur. We're looking south towards the campus. The street that you see in the upper left-hand corner is Gortner. Thanks for laughing. That's good. Yeah, thank you. Oh, Adam is here. Adam, I forgot. Were you waving at me and I just ignored you? Adam Granger has St. Anthony Park books to sell you. If you're interested, he's going to have them along for this section and the next and the next. And if you're not here and you want to know how to be in touch with Adam, I will put you in touch with Adam. So thank you for bringing them. Thank you for reprinting them and publishing them.
Can I ask you a question?
Yeah.
The stalls that are behind that building at Como, you haven't shown a picture of it.
Oh.
Close with Midwest Printing.
Yeah.
Along the tracks at Como, they're now markets, like African markets.
Oh, cool. I don't know them. I haven't.
They look to be old enough to be the vintage of the Midwest Printing building.
Interesting.
It's behind that bar, the station.
Oh, behind Station 280. Yeah. So south of Como.
Right.
The Midwest Printing is to the north of Como. Yep. Interesting. That, I think, is a 19-teens, 1920s building, that whole complex. Excellent. Something to explore. Behind Station 280. Yes, you can drive back there. There used to be a lot of huge potholes in it, maybe still, but you can drive back there. And it's not visible in this picture. Now that I've gone back, here is the Bass family. M.D. Bass was Martha Bass, pictured on the left. He was a big real estate dealer. It was really typical for property ownership to be in both husband and wife's names, or sometimes just the woman. And in this case, her initials are on the property for the Bass farm, not farmers. The real estate documents were signed by, I think, the kid in the middle, their son Edgar, who went on to be a professor. I think he was a math professor at West Point. And he's the one who signed the papers with the university. Here's 1885-86. St. Anthony Park is just underway. So you can see that the plat for St. Anthony Park is complete. Down here, there's the manufacturing district. The co-op is right about there. Hampton Park, I'll be talking about that in May. It's right there. So this is done, and they have not yet included the plat for the northern section of the neighborhood, but that's what's here. N.P. Langford owned the property between Dudley and Hoyt, Cleveland, and about Grantham, or the alley just east of Grantham. So his name is there. The University Grove is up here. So here it is, State University Agricultural College and Experimental Farm. They had this 155 acres. They originally did not have a 5-acre piece right here by Fairview. They did eventually acquire most all of this. It goes all the way over to Snelling. That's Snelling there. Here's the fairgrounds. They had a little bit of property, I think they still do, into this lower quadrant of Section 21. And then there was a piece of property that now belongs to the U that belonged to a farmer whose family also farmed up here. And that was acquired by 1906 because that's the lawn and the area where Coffee Hall is built. So that strip along Cleveland had, maybe it's the reason that there's a lawn there. They'd mostly been building north of Beaufort at that point. They acquired that central section where it says experimental farm. They got that from Langford and Marshall, who owned that. They weren't developing it as part of the neighborhood originally, but they still held the property, and they sold that land to the U. So they pieced it together and then have added more acreage as time goes on. We'll see a map about that later. So the purchase of the land around 1882, they started building in 1884 with 2 buildings. They don't actually get enough people to run the school until 1887, 1888. And it's an interesting mix of students. It was a college, it was higher education, but they also had a program for high school students to come in for shorter periods of time to get practical training and education. And then they ran and still run the Experimental Farm Extension Service. So things that had a practical and immediate application. Here's one of the 2 buildings they built. It was designed by a famous Minneapolis architect named Leroy Buffington. He did the West Hotel. He did the Pillsbury A Mill. That's one of his buildings that's still surviving. Right around this time, he did the 2nd State Capitol building. Not one of his great successes. It was criticized immediately and nicknamed Buffington's Lemon. It sat where the old Science Museum building was, 10th and Cedar, kind of in that area. And pretty quickly after that opened, they started planning for the state capitol we have now. Okay, so this is the barn, and you can see it's a pretty big thing, and it has room for everybody. It's the cows and the horses and the sheep and the pigs and the poultry and the whole shebang, and all the equipment that would go along with them. It was not a huge institution at this point, and so it's a big barn, but that's all they had. They had this building and one other. Here we're looking at it from the hero shot side. This is the State Fair grandstand side. So this is the view of the building that you would typically see. It was too far off Larpenteur to be paying a lot of attention to it, but this is kind of the showy side of the building. And here, after 1904, I know that because this is the livestock pavilion. You might recognize those acroteria, that decoration right along there. This is a livestock pavilion. This is Gortner, right along there. This is Buford. And you can see that this building sat right in the middle of the intersection. So I think it burned in 1917. When it disappeared in 1917, they had a chance to kind of redo their campus plan, because when they just dropped these 2 buildings in, like whatever. This one's called the Farmhouse, and it had a similar kind of multifunction purpose. It was the residence for some professors over the years. There was a lot of equipment stored here. It was down the hill. You can see the hill on the left. Gortner was kind of along, or would come to be along the right-hand side of the slide. And here they are in a print, barn on the left, the farmhouse on the right. And these were pretty close together. The farmhouse, if Hendon continued straight through, and Hendon does pick up again in the campus, but if it continued straight through the campus, it would come out here where the farmhouse is. And Buford was down where the barn was. So they were just about a block apart. Here they are in a photograph. And then, as you can see, not much else. In this case, we're looking from the northeast towards the southwest. Again, St. Anthony Park getting going. This is an advertisement, essentially an advertising magazine that includes the railroads and developments along the railroads. So St. Anthony Park, oh, how did that happen? Whatever, St. Anthony Park is down here. Here's the factory. There's the Raymond Bridge. Here's the little railroad island. Langford Park is up here. So this is the original part of St. Anthony Park, and off in the distance, the fairgrounds, including the 1885 grandstand, and the barn. Bigger than life, probably because they wanted to say, look what we're close to. Look how convenient this is. A map from 1888, I've turned it on its side so you get a little sense of what's going on. North is to the right. So as we know now, the fields are here along Larpenteur. Here it's labeled Como Road. Forestry plantation, tillage. Here we've got the sheep pasture, meadow and pasture. State fairgrounds are over here. The buildings are here. There's the house. There's the barn. This is a greenhouse. They were about to build a building out here in 1887-88, so they've drawn it in the map. This is the high point. This is the hillside. Nursery, gardens. So it's an interesting glimpse of what things look like. So there's the northwest corner. Gibbs Avenue is what they called Cleveland. So Gibbs Avenue, north-south here is running across the top of the slide. Como Avenue along the right-hand side of the slide. Tillage land, forestry plantation, experimental grounds over here. So everything was pretty compact, and they would start to build pretty much in this area. Here you can see another view of it with just a few things here. Greenhouse, maybe water tower. I'm not sure what that box is. There's the farmhouse, and the barn. And here is a farm building. There were actually a group of them in this strip of land along Cleveland that the university didn't own until later. Here's the old school that sat at Larpenteur and Cleveland, now replaced by the Bell Museum. Education of a different sort. Buford goes in straight, at least at first, because it's on the quarter section line running into section 21. There was no road there originally. The access was from the north. And Buford in the neighborhood doesn't line up. As you know, there's that stoplight and there's that little jog. So this is not on the section line, and this is or would become on the section line. So here we're looking at a 1903 fire insurance map that gives us an arrangement of the buildings. Yellow means it's a frame construction building. Pink means it's brick. So we have our original buildings. There's the farmhouse and there's the barn. And then we have a sheep barn down here, and we get poultry, and we get vet. Oh, this is a dairy barn, I think, but they start to get a vet district down here. The drill hall, the dairy hall. Here's the horticulture building with its greenhouse next to it. Here is a chemistry building that was replaced by home ec. And then over in this corner at Cleveland, never mind the Gibbs thing, and private driveway, current Buford, St. Anthony Park, Buford, set at an angle again. Down here we get the farm that didn't belong to the U, all its farm buildings. And then here, some of their construction. So this is what we'll look at next. An 1887 building called the Home Building, dormitory, 1888. This is North Hall. This was a dining hall, lasted until 1991, I think. The 1890s, almost 100 years. This was a home ec building, then later a chemistry building. This was a women's dorm. This was a boys' dorm from 1902. So it doesn't yet have the lawn and coffee hall and the other two buildings that match it down here, because that's not even University of Minnesota property yet. Here's the Home Building, designed by Buffington, the same guy who did the first two buildings. And it was frame construction, but he had a typical Richardsonian Romanesque arch around the door, which was kind of an anomaly, big stone arch, and then shingles and frame construction back here. It was used as a music building for a while. It was a health services building for a while. It was demolished in the 1950s. And why are we looking at this, you say? Well, this is Bailey Hall, a residence hall that's in that spot. And if you go into their driveway, there's this thing. How many of you have seen this? A few of you have been there. If you go around to the other side, you see that they have preserved the old entrance to the Home Building. So there it is again, right? And here's a little plaque that they have on it, decorated by, it looks like, students and birds, both. So the Alumni Association put this up. Here's a little picture of the building to commemorate that space. So that's the home building. That was first. Here's Pendergast Hall, 4-story dorm/classroom building. It was for boys and men, and it was the next thing that they built. So it's sitting where it's sat where Bailey Hall sits right now. So dorm space remains dorm space essentially. This is north, the dining hall building, and there it is. Again, that lasted until the 1990s. And our next shot will show us the doorway, not with all these guys hanging out in front, but a bunch of women on the steps. Yeah. The arch is, let's see if I can find a map that might help us out. Okay, so you wouldn't see it from the street. Here's Cleveland, and here's Buford. If you go up this way, there's a parking lot here that serves Bailey Hall, which is right in here. And if you go in and around Bailey Hall, into the little U-shaped driveway that's behind it, that's where it is. Quite hidden. So the home building, Pendergast, North Hall, entrance to North Hall, kind of fancy. This is the first home ec building, which then became, it's 1890 is when it was built, it then became a chemistry building. And I think that this class was inside of that building and not in the 1914 building. And I wonder, looking at this, 4 women with boxes of dirt on the ground, and then women at counters and jars up above. Are they making earthworm jelly, or what's going on? What's the recipe here? Learning new things. And here they are in one of the classrooms. I love the hats. About half of them keep their hats on. I suppose that has something to do with your hairstyle. So that's this building. So the next set of buildings are one of the places they built up on the hill. Not great for farming, by the way, because it's up on the hill. Pendergast home building, north, and the home ec building. Across Buford, on the south, we get a couple other buildings. The drill hall is this one, and then this is the dairy building, or the dairy hall, they called it. So here's the drill hall. It was used for a number of things. It was plant pathology. It had, it cycled through a lot of uses. It lasted until the 1950s, I think, maybe the 60s. I wonder if I have it written down. I might. Let's see. 1971. It lasted until 1971. The dairy building, 1890 to 1960. Here's the dairy building, and it started with a smaller section, just this section and that wing, and then they added on the rest of it. Many of these buildings in the 1890s, up until about 1901, 1902, were designed by an architect named Charles Aldrich. He taught drawing, mechanical drawing, on the St. Paul campus. He did a lot of work for the university. So he did North Hall. He did the horticulture building. He did these 2 buildings. He did the armory in the Minneapolis campus. That might be one that you know. He did the building that the co-op is in, Hampton Park Co-op. That's an Aldrich building. So he did houses. His own house on Keston is one of those. He did sort of whatever he was hired to do. And he was hired to do a lot of stuff at the University of Minnesota. About 1900, 1901. It was the International Order of Oddfellows Hall. So they had a big meeting space upstairs. It's still a big space upstairs. And then they had commercial space downstairs. Some guys with cool bikes here. Drill Hall, closest to them, Dairy Hall on the way down the street behind them. So they're facing towards the west, towards Cleveland, and Buford is up here on my side of the slide. Across the street was the horticulture building, now part of the whole McNeil Hall complex. And you can see also behind it the chemistry building, 1902. This is one of Aldrich's last buildings on the campus, because pretty soon Clarence Johnston would take over. And this building is still standing, but it has a Clarence Johnston addition on the roof. So it doesn't look all Victorian like this anymore. So there's some kind of collaboration across time. A sheep barn, as the campus expands, and grows both, they were able to kind of sort out and separate the animals, one set from another. They were able to move the animals farther away from where the people lived and worked. And so we get buildings like this from 1896, probably Aldrich as well. This is one of the poultry buildings. And I think that is State Fair back there. That's the grandstand. And then this, I think, is the sheep barn. It might be the sheep barn. Lots of greenhouses. They started at the core of the campus and moved out. Well, the core of the campus was all there was to the campus, so of course that's where they were. But here we're fairly close to the windmill and the water tower that we've seen in many places with relatively small greenhouses compared to what would come. So I don't know if you noticed or not, here's the horticulture greenhouse. That whole thing is a greenhouse attached to the horticulture building. It's not there anymore, but there are plenty of greenhouses, of course, and they're kind of spendy in terms of space, and so they're off to the edges as well. Around the turn of the century, we get 1904, the livestock pavilion. This faces Buford. It's still standing, and its side, going down towards the left, that's where Gortner is. So that picture that we had of the barn that had this building next to it, we were looking kind of around the corner on this side of the building. So that you would have a place to show animals, to judge animals, to practice that, to get your extension folks to come in. That as opposed to saying, well, let's just gather in the sheep barn and then we'll move the sheep around where we need them to be. This was a formal space that they could use for showing off, for teaching, for selling, all those kinds of things. This is what it looked like on the inside originally. Dirt floor, of course, makes sense. And here's what it looks like now. That's Buford that we're looking at, and this picture was taken from the corner of Gortner, looking up towards Cleveland. A dairy barn, now part of the veterinary complex. This is probably started by Aldrich and finished or revised by Clarence Johnston. At the time that this was done, Johnston was doing all kinds of what we sometimes call Jacobean-style houses or Tudor-style houses on Summit Avenue and other places, and here he's got a Tudor dairy barn that he includes on the campus. The three big buildings, kind of emblematic for the campus itself, facing the lawn. They had to wait to exist until the property was purchased from the family that had owned it, and they started building on the left. That's Coffee Hall from 1906. It was called the main building, the administration building. It finally named Coffee Hall after a couple of decades. And Coffee lived just a couple blocks away. He lived at the corner of Commonwealth and Raymond, at 1315 Raymond, I think is what it is. Then the next building is in the next decade. These are all Clarence Johnston buildings, and it's nice if you have one architect who's doing all the work, because he can be thoughtful and respectful without saying, oh, that Clarence Johnston, he's the worst. Let me show you what I can do. He's respecting the earlier buildings. So even though it's 1906, 1911 to 13 for the agricultural engineering building in the middle, and then the dairy building on the end, Hacker Hall is 1923-25. Even though they're separated by decades, he's made them so they all kind of match and work together. You wouldn't necessarily know so much about function or even the fact that the agricultural engineering building has as much of a building, maybe 2 times as big behind it. He's kind of lining these up so they've got that front-facing sense, and then doing what he needs to do with the rest of the spaces behind. Here's the dairy building, Hacker Hall, with the sculpture that's across Eccles out in front. It's just a sculpture that commemorates the work of the inhabitants of the campus and the work of the university. Dave, do you remember? 90s, maybe?
It's after 90s.
After the 90s?
Yeah.
Okay. So the 2000s. This millennium. Here we're looking towards Commonwealth. So our back is to agricultural engineering and Coffee Hall. This is the side of Hacker Hall. And I just wanted to point out a couple of things here. The buildings are nice when you look at them in the big range. They're pretty impressive. But Johnston was pretty careful, especially Johnston, but other architects would do this as well. But he would put small details into buildings to make them interesting. So if you look at these these little blind arches along here. If you look at these roundels that have different colors of tile in them, he's rewarding you for paying attention. He's keeping you from being bored if you walk by this building for your entire career. There's kind of something to see and something interesting about it. And sometimes he does it with sculpture, and sometimes he does it with these colorful tiles. You can have a look at this one or this one. Dave, do you know what's coming? You know what's coming. So sculpture down here, it's got the date of the building in it, and then it's labeled. So it was named by its function first. It was the dairy building. Now it's named for T.L. Hecker, who was a very well-known professor in this area, this department. He did studies and wrote about what we would call now biochronology, like what to feed the cows when, so that they would produce, not just like, oh yeah, go milk the cows. There was something scientific about what they did. And so making these discoveries and writing books and promoting it and teaching farmers about it was all a part of the university's work. And I do have to point out, part of the decoration here, as you can see up there, open books. Always good for a center of learning. But that's especially because the University of Minnesota was the first place to teach cows how to read. There you go. Worked again. Okay, so some other things about what was happening in the 20s about the time that building was completed. This is the era when the University Grove idea was hatched by Middlebrook, who was the vice president for eventually business administration. He was the comptroller. He had, as many college administrators do, a concern for housing. And we might think, stay in your lane. That's not your job. But housing is what, in the case of the Grove's mission, what would attract and retain faculty and administrators. They could find a place to live. It would be a nice place to live. They could stay there for their career. That whole idea was something that made it worth the investment, that you get someone on staff and you can keep them. That's really important for success. Middlebrook got ideas for this, traveled around the country, and visited campuses where there was designated university faculty housing like this. And then his house was one of the first. Here's his house, late 1920s, on Falwell, out towards the west end of Falwell. There he is. Well, actually, in both pictures, he was nicknamed the mayor of the Grove because he didn't just come up with the idea and have a nice house. He organized and sort of made people feel welcome and did all the kinds of things that helped this to be a successful neighborhood. And you see him on the left with a bucket of water. He came up with the idea of a victory garden, a community garden, in the area that is now housing but was open space until the post-war years, between Falwell and Hoyt, going east from Kaufman. So newer 1960s and 70s houses in that spot. I've cut it off here because I didn't want you to see these, but now I'll show them to you. These are Quonset huts and old barracks repurposed from the Second World War. This was student housing. And before that went in, that ended up being garden space. And Middlebrook was the instigator of the community garden and then, as you can see, pitched in to do the work. So a lot of housing-related issues become, if they're smart, the purview of administrators, especially people in business. Retaining students is worth all the effort because you've recruited them and you've invested in them, and if they go away because they can't find a place to live, then that's money down the drain. So thinking about residence halls, thinking about faculty and staff housing, a really important contribution, starting with the Grove in the late 1920s. So here we're back at the campus space again to pick up with some of the other kinds of buildings. Again, moving out from the two original buildings here and then kind of making an increasingly dense ring of buildings. There's horticulture, there's the chemistry building, there's the new 1914 home ec building. We'll look at that in just a minute. A dormitory for women, another dormitory for women, the old home ec building. So we've seen some of these. Here's the dairy hall and the drill hall. And then we start to get buildings, main building, that's coffee hall. Here's agricultural engineering, since I mentioned it. There's what you see from Cleveland, which kind of matches this. And here's what's behind it. So the bulk of the building is not even visible from the front. So spreading out towards the south and the east, that ring of buildings expanding even more. They've jumped way up to build the gym, and there will be then a big ring of buildings that comes around this way. Johnston, again, famous architect, does all kinds of fancy houses. If they said, we need a barn, he'd go, okay, how big? Where do you want the windows? Should we negotiate this? Should we negotiate that? So as they spin out from that original barn to have a cattle barn, a horse barn, a sheep barn, Johnston steps in to do a suite of buildings that have this kind of farm feeling and flavor to them. Not actually a bad idea when you're training farmers, when you've got farm kids coming in for education and people coming in for extension courses, to feel at home, to see buildings that are recognizable to them. Here is another Johnston building. This is the Home Ec building from 1914, now connected all the way down to Buford. Again, look at the brickwork, look at the tile work. He's invested design-wise in these buildings to make them look interesting. It got connected to another building in the 40s and 50s. You can see it back here. They were doing some construction back here. You can't even see it from the Upper Buford Circle Street anymore because it's covered by the 1970s section of the building. But this represents a really big expansion in Home Ec and then eventually College of Design. And speaking of Home Ec, these two houses sat until relatively recently facing Cleveland at Commonwealth. These are Home Ec facilities as well. They were called the Home Management Houses. And Home Ec students would live here for a semester with other Home Ec students. There was a professor, there was a staff member, and then, people always find this amazing, they had a laboratory child. So they got a kid, a baby, a toddler, from the Children's Home Society, the orphanage over on Commonwealth. And then the kid, they'd take turns doing the laundry and taking care of the baby and all of that sort of thing. Amazing, right? Off here in the background, I think that's agricultural engineering, and I think that's Coffee Hall. All right, something else that happened that's kind of interesting is that they had to make some decisions. They were doing this in the 19-teens about how much to build and what to build on the St. Paul campus. Because the students on the St. Paul campus needed writing classes, and they maybe needed a math class, and they maybe needed history or something like that. And would they replicate the Minneapolis campus in St. Paul? Would they have an English department, two of them, one on each campus, math on each campus? And what they decided to do was to take advantage of something they were just instituting, that is transit, to connect the campuses to each other. So they could, instead of duplicating buildings, and faculty and staff, they could just put the students on the streetcar and move them back and forth. So they started out, this is a transit map for the Twin Cities. Oh, sorry, St. Paul, just St. Paul. They started out over here in that area with the little diagonal street, that industrial area that has the Central Minnesota rail line in it. They were getting supplies for their barns and fuel and all the rest that were delivered by rail to that spot, and that was the closest that it could come by rail. So then they had to figure out how to move it, and they could drive wagons back and forth. They did. But then they thought, well, if we build our own little rail line, we can just load up our trains and then bring it across, which is what they ended up doing. So here in kind of short form is the University Electric Railway. Goes to the State Farm, and then up around and down Eustis, and then it joined the Twin Cities streetcar line tracks on Como and ran to the campus. Then they had private tracks that went from, I think it was 14th, across University and into the campus, and then you may remember that big turn, that big roundabout area that's now gone, pretty much engineered out. They have gardens there, but that's where the trains turned around to go back to St. Paul. Here they are building, summer of 1914. You can kind of see what the Breck Woods area looked like as they made space for the tracks. Here is the station at the University Grove. So if you're on Falwell near Vincent and look for a sidewalk that goes between some houses, you'll find some stairs that go right down. Do you all know the tracks? Have you walked on the tracks? Walked your dogs on the tracks? If not, check it out. This concrete platform, still there. Little house gone. This is the Board of Regents. They made a celebratory trip to the St. Paul campus when the line opened. You can see the barn, the original barn, in the background behind the trees. So the university rented cars essentially from the Twin Cities Rapid Transit Company and hired their own conductors, charged their own fares. 19-teens also brought buildings like the gym. This is a big athletic field. It's planned on the designs, and it stayed there. Clarence Johnston did that, and then his firm continued to work for the university for quite a while. 1937-38, this is Green Hall, named for Samuel Green, forestry, and the little decorations that are right up here, little green pine trees on a red background, little tile decorations there. Again, you're rewarded for looking carefully. This is the animal husbandry building, now social work building, and it's a 1949 Clarence Johnston firm. Johnston himself had died by that point, but his son Howie had been working with him since the 19-teens, and so he continued the practice. Again, some great decor here. There's a guy with a couple of animals right there that he's sheltering. Animal husbandry was a sort of a project of Andrew Boss, the Boss family, really important for the neighborhood and very important for the U. His brother William was the one who started the agricultural engineering department. So those two guys had a huge impact on the neighborhood. Unfortunately named, however, because the university is built on the Bass farm, and then we have the Boss brothers who are so important. It's like hard to keep straight. Here's Peters Hall again. That sculpture, animal husbandry sculpture, is up here. So they go into modern, they go into Art Deco, they've been in Tudor, they do all the up-to-date styles as adapted to academic buildings like this. So although this is labeled 1958 in the lower left-hand corner, that's a library marking. This is a little bit earlier, dividing up the campus as it was probably early 1950s. So St. Paul Campus Institute of Agriculture buildings in Section A, Sections A, kind of the core of the campus. Here's the high point on the hill, there's the gym. The original buildings were over here but gone now. Here's the railroad track, by the way. And the reason that Gortner curves is because the railroad track had to curve, the streetcar track. They don't turn corners. And so that big sweep out was something that was accommodated in Gortner Avenue in that area. And then the trains turned around, the streetcars turned around right in here. So this Sections A, those four sections are the buildings. And then we've got the experimental plots and fields, that's B. By this time you can see all of the expansion that's been undertaken on the east side of Fairview up to Roselawn. You know these fields over here along Cleveland between Larpenteur and Roselawn. C is the student housing. This is the post-war housing in the barracks. E is the Grove. D is the golf course. That's the Gibbs Farm. They didn't own the Gibbs Farm. And I couldn't resist this one. It's kind of nice. Women golfing at the golf course. Okay, so we're back at this again, just to kind of see about that expansion. F is student housing, proposed married student housing. It says permanent. So they were going to get rid of all those barracks and then extend the Grove and then put in permanent housing. Here are the barracks. So here's the old section of the Grove. We're looking from the sky, but this is north. So here's Larpenteur, here's Cleveland, here's the gym, there's the athletic field, there's Bailey Hall right there, so the sort of cluster of buildings at that corner. Here's Murray with its track, its open space before the new building was built. So these are all the barracks, and there were 2 or 3 per lot. So when they all got cleared out in the 1960s and houses were built, there were many fewer houses than there were examples of this. This is again part of the how do we deal with housing issues. Post-war housing was a huge challenge, a huge problem. Thatcher Hall was another example. This was on Commonwealth. We're looking towards the fairgrounds here. So this is facing north towards much of the campus with what will become the Commonwealth Terrace buildings behind it. Housing was such a problem that this was built for graduate students, married graduate students, and it wasn't a big, 4-bedroom apartment kind of arrangement. It was pretty condensed. In 1947, they kicked all the students out because they had new faculty coming in and no place for them to live. There was a huge housing crisis really across the country. So it was faculty who lived in here, and I think they had a limited period of time to find some place to live. It's like you can be here for a year and then you're out because we need to turn over the housing again. So again, the kind of work that Middlebrook did to kind of make space for people and allow them to stay was fairly important. Here's the Commonwealth Terrace project. It was done in 2 phases, starting in the 1950s. And then some of the more recent buildings. This is the Biological Sciences building. This essentially became possible. I mean, there was a gap of 25 years or so, but this became an open space when the streetcars weren't coming through and looping around through this spot anymore. And it's the tallest building without being on a super tall spot. Here's the Raptor Center. This is a 1988 building down towards the Vet Center. Here's Borlaug Hall, 1985, which isn't just the building that you see here up on the top of the hill, 3-4 stories tall. It connects to older buildings that are down the hill. So it's a kind of a chain that associates, or an interlocking spot that associates all of these other buildings with them, named for a statue, named for Norman Borlaug. You all know about him? Nobel Peace Prize, 1970, for the Green Revolution. It's estimated that his work in agriculture and in growing things effectively saved 1 billion lives, that many people would have starved if he had not done what he did, and he got the Nobel Peace Prize for it. Minnesota guy, University of Minnesota product, bachelor's degree in forestry, I think, and then his MA and PhD in plant pathology. So not just a University of Minnesota guy, a St. Paul campus guy. This is, I think, the newest building on campus. Correct me if I'm wrong. This is the microbial cell production facility, where they do biotech experiments. 2003, I think it opened in the fall of 2003. It's a BWBR building, and it's on Buford. But again, given how built the rest of the campus is, you need to go out towards the east, in this case, towards the fairgrounds, to get to this building. So there you have it, an introduction to the campus. And now we get another view with fields and greenhouses and the Cargill building. I'm looking for barns. The horse barn used to be here. Now it's the Cargill building. But there you can see some silos on the cattle barn right there. So a whole mix of styles and decades and generations representing this commitment that was made by the University of Minnesota for education in agriculture and the mechanical arts. Any questions? Yeah. Sure, the names of buildings, on and off again, how do they change? The first thing, I guess, is that they changed the purpose of the building. So they would rename the home ec building to be the chemistry building, which it was until they built another chemistry building. That had to do with home ec essentially outgrowing its facilities, and they responded by building something new, but there was nothing wrong with the original building except it was too small for this dramatically growing program. So then there gets to be a new name, another name based on purpose. The other thing, though, is that a lot of buildings, I think it's true across college and university campuses, they have a functional name like agricultural engineering. It's what goes on in the building, it's what the building was built for. But then, well, main, that's a good one. The main building, the administration building, is now Coffee Hall. You get somebody you want to name it after, sometimes a donor, sometimes a faculty member or administrator. And so there's been a near constant shift as things get changed and built and rebuilt and renamed, repurposed, so that the name of the building, you don't go to your chemistry classes in 1912 in the home ec building. It's like now it's the chemistry building and that's what happens there. Does that get at your question?
Yes, but I should say the reason I asked is I grew up with two fellow Hecker, and the grandchildren of the Hecker Hall. And I think they've been contacted by a group that recently is looking at changing the name of that building, which, of course, they might not see happen.
So the follow-up question, and it looks like Dave might know something about that, is that the children of T.L. Hecker, grandchildren, have been contacted about a possible name change for that building. And I haven't heard anything about it, but that happens sometimes.
I was going to go backwards and say, I think, with other people
Okay. So Dave says they won't give a person's, he thinks they won't give a person's name to a building until the person has died. Hecker, by the way, oh, Brunings, yeah, that's true. Brunings is an example of that. Hang on just a sec. There are some old pictures. If I remember to bring one next time, I will. Hecker lived in a fabulous, fascinating house at the corner of Gordon and Raymond, way up on the hill, up behind, well, unfortunately, it would have been behind the gas station, but the hill has been cut down. So the house is gone. It would have been kind of above where the gas station sits. There is one house that's left there that is a similar size and a similar age. It's obviously a multi-unit house now because there's a fire escape up the outside. But that's where he lived, and it had this really interesting arch opening at the front of it. And so he, like a lot of these people, lived in the neighborhood, and they certainly would have walked over to the campus to get to work. Yeah, you had a question.
Can you go back to the slide with the military barracks?
Yep.
I think that was during World War II.
After World War II. So the barracks were in use by the Army. There it is. Yep. They'd been in use by the Army, and then the Army had a ton of surplus property that they were getting rid of. Larpenteur is at the bottom of the slide going left to right. Cleveland, yep, bottom of the slide going across. We're looking south, yep. So Cleveland is what's going from the bottom to the top of the slide along the left.
There's a school there, the old school at the corner of Larpenteur.
Yes, this is the old one-room schoolhouse right there, the Gibbs School it was called. This is where the tennis courts are. This is where... On the west side of Cleveland, right. So this is Hoyt. That's Kaufman. Falwell's right. Falwell comes through here. It still does. Follows that. So this is Falwell going out here. This is Hoyt. Yep. Uh-huh.
Thank you. Just one other question.
Sure.
I love it that they put signs up to help you identify, like the beeping place, everything on the campus. But I find it absolutely inspiring every year to drive Larpenteur and Fairview and watch the crops.
Yes.
This is the light of springtime in Minnesota.
Yep.
I just wondered if anybody's ever thought of labeling those fields. I was wondering, are these soybeans or are these something else?
So the question is about what's...
Put on some names on the field.
Yeah, maybe, but there's a reason that there aren't names on the field. So the comment was how fun it is to watch the crops grow and to drive along on these roads and to see that happening and to know what those things are. My understanding is that what grows in the fields is determined year by year based on proposals that people make for some project, research project that they have. I need X amount of space, I'm planning to do this, it's for an extension demonstration that I'm doing later, it's for this department and some graduate students working on this. So it could be labeled soybeans one year and it could be oats the next. Yeah. So that's maybe why they don't label it. Right, they change it from year to year. Yes, you had a question.
My question is about the location of the agriculture school. I know, like, you mentioned University of Texas, Texas A&M, like, those are different locations in the state.
Mm-hmm.
And I was wondering, was there any talk of, like, placing the St. Paul campus, like, in rural Minnesota, since it's an agriculture school?
Sure. Yep. So the question was about where these institutions are located and whether there was any discussion about the St. Paul campus not being St. Paul, but in a rural location. The first institution, as I understand, that got the land grant nod was some little fledgling agricultural college in Glencoe. And that was the mid-1860s. And then the U kind of got its act together and it got scooped up and associated with the university. When it started, it was really quite rural. And this was farming land all around it. And the universities actually preserved that sense of farming when it would have been developed, I'm sure, in many other directions. Lots of suburban houses, for instance. There is a description that I read about a couple of students coming to the U in the late 1880s. So remember, there were just a handful of buildings at that point. They got off the train down by the Raymond Bridge, and they walked to the campus, which is doable, of course, probably easier for them than it is for us. And they commented how there was nothing there. It was just desolate until they got up to Professor so-and-so's house. Professor Green and Professor Snyder lived kind of kitty corner at Raymond and Commonwealth. And it was, I think one of them quit because he was from some big town like Moorhead, or, I mean, that's too big. Crosby. He was from a big town like Crosby, where they had stores and buildings and churches and houses and stuff, and this campus was just out in the middle of nowhere. So there was a move to have it be in a rural spot, although if you got a train station, which everybody wanted, and the trains came through, then you would look for growth in whatever small town you were in. But I think that initial intention to have it on the Minneapolis campus or very close to it just stuck with them. And so they went a couple miles away and found better land and a lot of space that they could work with. Yeah, it's a great question. Yes?
When was the first street paved in the area?
The question is when the first street was paved in the area. I think that Como might have been the first one paved, and paving was, places were lucky if they had paving in the late 19th century. And they would pave, meaning you weren't driving on dirt anymore, by putting in cobblestones, bricks, wooden blocks. That was a standard paving material that was quieter if you had horses and wagons going over it, if you can imagine. Sometimes they didn't want paving right away because paved streets could be so noisy when the traffic was going on them. But they started, downtown streets were getting paved in the late 19th century. Here, I don't think until the early 20th century, and not all at once. It was major streets before it was side streets. And what they got and what they often worked on were sidewalks rather than paved streets. So it didn't really matter what happened when you were on your horse or in your carriage. It could be muddy and icky. That was not such a big deal. Crossing might be a bit of a problem. But if you could walk on a boardwalk, usually, then that was good. That was what people lobbied for, really, from the start. I've got a 1913-14 map from Hennepin County that shows this neighborhood, and the majority of streets in this neighborhood were not paved in 1913, 1914. Yes?
So some of the photos that you've shown tonight, like this one in particular, because my husband, as a toddler, lived in those Quonset huts, and I'd love to have him see it. Is it available either on your site or on university media?
These images are all available on UMedia. They have multiple views of this. So they sent that plane up and they took pictures in all different directions. There's an interesting set of them. Must have been a contact sheet of some sort that they did, because there are 4 views that are dated 67, 69, 70, 72, something like that, that shows more and more of these buildings going away and then some of the houses starting to be built in their place. But UMedia is a great place to look. And I would search for either Grove East, although the difficulty is then you might get Grove and East rather than the two. I've tried quotation marks, I've tried the Boolean and. I kind of haven't figured out their search mechanisms. You could just search for the Grove, because then you'll see all of these pictures, including this stuff. But yeah, UMedia has a nice collection of them. Mm-hmm. The golf course was started in the 1920s. And it started, I think, as a non-university project first, and then the university used student money to buy the land and turn it into the golf course. Anything else? Okay, thanks for coming. Come back next time.